and welcome again to Outwith, the podcast that takes you beyond our borders and beyond the headlines. I'm Hala Mohideen. Now, I am old enough to remember when Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York. He was the feted mayor who helped steer the city through the turmoil after the city was attacked back in 2001. Fast forward almost 2 decades now, and Mr. Giuliani is still in the news, but this time he's perhaps better known as Donald Trump's lawyer. Now, he's been doing the rounds on various media circuits, defending the president's agenda, defending the president's actions almost. But one recent story caught my eye. This is where Rudy Giuliani is getting involved in politics in Romania. Why Romania? Well, to find out. I'm joined by Kit Gillet, a journalist whose article in the New York Times has been outlining exactly why this former mayor of New York is weighing in on efforts to tackle corruption in the country. Kit, welcome to Outwith.
Thank you, Hala.
First up, where is Romania? I had to Google it this morning, which just shows you the extent of my knowledge. We were trying to pinpoint it on the map this morning. I got it dreadfully wrong. Tell us a bit more about this country.
So geographically, it's in the far east of Europe. It's a bit north of Bulgaria, next to Ukraine, and bordering with parts of ex-Yugoslavia, so Serbia, and Hungary as well. So it's right in that kind of area, a little bit north of Greece, a bit west, a bit more east of everywhere else. Now, the country was part of the old Soviet bloc. So up in between the Second World War and 1989, it was a communist country. And during the flow of revolutions that took down the Warsaw Pact in 89, it was one of those. It was actually the only one of those that had a bloody revolution. So a few thousand people died in the fighting, and Nicolae Ceausescu, who was the dictator at the time, was executed on Christmas Day, 1989. Romania is actually a part of the EU now. It's one of the 28 countries. It joined in 2007 along with Bulgaria. So it's one of the newer members, and that has had a big impact on the country, joining the EU and the process of joining, both on, the movement of people, but on the economy and on some of the political moves and, yes, some of the impacts.
It's had a positive effect, has it not, joining the European Union?
Yes, very much so. I don't think you would find many Romanians who would disagree with that. I mean, a lot of those changes have been economic. They have been, allowing people to migrate and to earn money abroad, but there's been EU funds that have come into Romania. But at the same time, there has been the impact of kind of institutional pressures from Brussels for Romania to clean up its act, whether that's in corruption or whether that's in, certain areas of institutional kind of controls. And that's kind of what we're seeing right now there's a lot of protests right now in this country, and there's a lot of issues, especially related to corruption. And the Giuliani story links into that in interesting ways.
All right. Well, we'll come to that in just a second, but just to kind of sort of set the scene now for people listening to this podcast, especially in the UK, Romania has certain connotations about it. When you think about Romania joining the EU, and there was the whole idea at the time. I remember we were sending reporters to the airports because as soon as travel restrictions were lifted, we were expecting Romanians to be coming in their tens of thousands, the way the polls were. And Romania was almost used as a kind of dirty word. It does have and it is unfortunately so. And I should add as well, we didn't see that Romanian wave coming in the way that it had been built up in the press. But I mean, this is a country where life is difficult, is it not? I mean, after shaking off the shackles of communism and transitioning, it's still a place known for crime, for inequality, and for poverty as well.
There are still lots of issues here. That's, undeniable. It is still one of the poorest countries in the EU. I mean, it has improved markedly, but, but it is still one of the poorer countries, lowest, among the lower wages. It is still one of the countries where perceived corruption is the highest. So, I mean, it has made very positive steps over the last 10 years or more. But, there are still major issues, and there is a growing divide. So in the big cities like Bucharest, the capital where I live, there is a lot of young people who are quite affluent, who are doing very interesting things. There's a lot of companies, there's a lot of economic growth and boom here. But in rural areas in the countryside, there are an awful lot of people who have been left behind. Now, it's actually quite interesting, economically, Romania was the fastest growing country in the EU last year. The economy here is booming. But again, it's booming in some of the cities. And there's 4 or 5 major cities where things are going incredibly well if you're an educated young person, especially in software and tech and areas like that. But again, in rural areas, in the countryside, which is a large percentage of the population, things have not changed, and things have, for many people, got worse.
Well, you could almost argue the sort of parallels with most places now. If you're in the cities, if you're in the cities and you're well trained and well versed in technology, then I guess the world is your oyster, really. In terms of for the people who are in the countryside, outside of these booming urban centres, it must be quite tough. I mean, it must be incredibly hard.
I mean, yeah, it really is. You get a lot of travel articles written about Romania, people, because, I mean, the nature is beautiful. I mean, it has some of the most pristine, untouched kind of agricultural rural areas in Europe. So a lot of travel articles get written. And one of the cliches is always that, horse-drawn carts go past. But, in the countryside, that is a reality. In the countryside areas, people still often use horses and carts for a lot of their day-to-day purposes. It's, things have not moved on in those areas to a high degree.
So it must be frustrating if you're using a horse-drawn cart and you're struggling to get food on the table, just because not everyone is living like this. There are some people who are doing incredibly well. Yeah,
there are. And then there is a growing middle class that are doing, very well for them, compared to their parents' generation. They are doing very well for themselves. But yeah, those who are stuck behind, those who are tending the land, those who are living in less affluent places in small towns, it's hard to find ways of, progressing, ways of kind of really moving up and finding, feeling comfortable in your life.
So, I mean, so talk to us now about corruption, because I understand that this is one of the big drivers for change. This is one of the things the EU has been asking Romania to work on quite heavily, and I guess there must be internal pressure as well if you have people driving horses and carts and they're seeing other people driving Bentleys and going to high-end clubs and flying private planes. I mean, tackling corruption must be something of an issue for them as well, no?
It's been a huge issue. Romania, corruption here was endemic, across all swathes of society. Long before I came here, but in the 90s, you did pay doctors, you did pay traffic cops, you played, it was just the nature of things that there was a passing of money for help, but what's interesting, and this was heavily linked to the country joining the EU, is there has been a huge drive to clean up corruption here. And it has had a strong impact. In neighbouring Bulgaria, there has been far less progress. And so corruption there is much more of an issue. But in Romania, when the country joined the EU, it set up an independent anti-corruption prosecutor's office. And that office, targeted high-end corruption, politicians, public figures, businessmen and women who are running some of the bigger companies, or just, running medium-sized companies. And this agency has prosecuted and successfully prosecuted thousands of politicians and business leaders in the last 10 years, but especially in the last 4 or 5 years, they've really ramped up the number of convictions. Now, this has caused issues in itself, but we're talking people who are successfully prosecuted for outrageous behaviour.
Tell me about this outrageous behaviour. I love outrageous behaviour. What sort of things are they being prosecuted for?
I mean, you have a lot of issues of, it's bribery, a lot of it, but it's also abuse of office. We're not talking insignificant figures, among the list of people kind of prosecuted successfully and sent to prison are, an ex-prime minister, government ministers, members of parliament. 2 months ago, the leader of the largest political party in Romania, a guy called Liviu Dragnea, was convicted and sentenced to 3.5 years for abuse of office. So he's appealing that right now. So he's not in prison right now. But interestingly, sadly for many Romanians, this isn't his first conviction. 2 years ago, he was again convicted of electoral fraud. So this is the leader of the largest party in the country for parliamentary seats, and he can't be prime minister because of his earlier conviction, but he is the man. He's the de facto prime minister, and this isn't. This is not. That's just an example. There are too many to count, really. Gosh. And there is currently in Romania there are. Sorry, let me just think this one through. You can still remain in office if you have a suspended sentence. So right now there is a petition going around that has over 1 million signatures trying to change this part of the constitution so that if you have a conviction, you cannot hold public office. Because at the moment you're allowed to.
1 million signatures. I mean, there's a real willingness, it seems, to deal with this because, we hear about corruption. We hear about corruption a lot, like in Ukraine, when everything started kicking off there a couple of years ago. Corruption was one of the things that was listed. And then you'd have a new government come in, and then there's corruption. These people turn out to be corrupt as well. But here in Romania, it does seem like there's a real willingness to actually tackle this head on. I mean, how successful do you see this in the long term? Do you see a real sort of shift in how are people getting less corrupt because of these efforts?
Yes, but the issue is that, that's the first half or the first act of the story. Right. And we are currently in the middle of the second act or the third act. And this has really been over the last year and a half. Okay. So there were parliamentary elections in December 2016. And almost straight away after that, the new government started trying to rein in the fight against corruption. So it started off by basically pushing through some emergency ordinance that kind of passed at 10 p.m. at night on like a Wednesday evening that effectively decriminalised low-level corruption. So if you're involved in if the financial damage of your case was less than the equivalent of about 20,000 euros, it wasn't really a crime.
Gosh.
And you couldn't be prosecuted. So that happened. And then within days, hundreds of thousands were protesting on the streets. And that actually peaked at about 500,000 people protesting, which were the largest protests since the fall of communism back in 1989. Yes. And so at that point, the government backed down, pulled that ordinance or, replaced it. And the justice minister at the time resigned. But, since then, there have been continual actions and reactions. Okay. So there have been threats, or there have been weakening of the independence of the judiciary. So judges and prosecutors have suddenly kind of seen their independence being weakened. There have been attempts to kind of pull back some of the tools that can be used to go after these cases. And the argument is that, the anti-corruption prosecutors were, heavily relying on court-approved wiretaps. But, wiretaps, especially in this region, have very negative connotations because of the secret police and because of pre-89. Yeah. So there's a lot of caution about that. And there's a sense that maybe, that the prosecutors are relying too heavily on these. But anyway, yes, there's been a huge amount of kind of movements that have then brought the people back onto the streets to protest. The head of this anti-corruption agency was fired about 2 months ago, and they're currently trying to find a replacement for her. But that angered a lot of people because she's very popular here and very popular among EU countries. And then basically a month ago, on August the 10th, there were more protests that actually ended up with a lot of tear gas used and water cannons and about 450 people needing medical help. And, it was a very unexpected kind of turn of events, because the protests up until now have, there have been small clashes, but very minor. And then suddenly this one evening, I was in the square, I caught some, quite a bit of tear gas myself. And, there's a sense that people are unsure if events are escalating, if things are getting better, worse. We're in a kind of very precarious moment right now, it feels like.
And I had no idea. So this is one of these crazy things. You hear a lot about, and this is the criticisms that get bandied around a lot. Oh, this party's corrupt and that party's corrupt when you're talking about politics in the UK or over in the US. Hillary Clinton is corrupt is one of the things that you hear a lot of. But this seems like a whole other level in Romania. And it sounds a little bit like you have a population who is sick of actual corruption, who are wanting, these prosecutors, this agency to get the job done. There's a lot of, they're putting a lot of faith in this system. And then they're electing politicians who are trying to undermine that work. That must be creating massive, massive tensions between the political class and the electorate.
Very much. It's important to say that all of the traditional parties have their issues with corruption. It is not just one or two parties. It is, there is an issue with the system, yes, that is perhaps slowly getting better, but it's not just one or two parties. Yeah. And it's very frustrating. Again, this is partly where you see this urban-rural divide come in as well, because the city populations, the younger populations, the more educated populations, they are wanting Romania to move fast towards a kind of more of a Western model and to clean its act up, and they're very angry about this. Okay. But the rural populations and in smaller places, the Social Democrat Party, the larger party, is very strong in those areas, and it's strong because it's a left of centre party. Mm-hmm. Its platforms are pensions, are money to it's the party that rural voters overwhelmingly vote for. And for them, the corruption issue has not spread well. There's a media issue here with certain channels that are more popular, that you see kind of a more of an American model of media, in the sense that you have more politicized publications and politicized TV stations. Right. And that influences, in some rural areas, what information there, or how the information is transmitted.
Okay. Where does Rudy Giuliani fit into all of this? Because now we have the overview of where Romania is, what's going on. It does sound like this sort of, obviously, it sounds a bit more extreme what's happening there in terms of protests and tear gas and all kinds of shenanigans and so on. But there does we have a broader understanding now of what's going on in Romania. What has Rudy Giuliani got to do with all of this? What's he doing meddling in this situation?
a very good question, and his arrival on the scene surprised a lot of people here.
Yeah.
It was very unexpected. Giuliani, as well as his work for Trump, he does
Well, you'd think he
work.
has enough on his plate, wouldn't he? I mean, if he's representing
Yeah,
Donald
but
Trump, that'd keep you busy, wouldn't it?
no, he's had a business for quite a few years where he supports in various ways some Turkish, some Iranian, some various influences, some political parties or businesses. He is a voice for hire in some places of the world. Now, his involvement here basically involved a letter. He wrote a letter to the president here and to other political leaders, voicing his concern about the anti-corruption fight and basically suggesting that it had gone too far, that those involved were politicizing things, that it was being too heavy-handed, and that those who had been prosecuted should be given an amnesty. That was basically the points of what he said. And this was, very much against the statements that we've had over the last year 10 years or more from the US State Department, from the embassy in Bucharest, who have been very supportive of the anti-corruption fight and very supportive of this anti-corruption agency. A few days after the letter came out, maybe a day after it started being reported in the Romanian press, I contacted the American embassy here, who basically said, one, we don't comment on opinions or from private US citizens, and two, look back on our previous statements, the most recent one from like a month before, saying that, we're supportive of Romania's anti-corruption fight, and we do not, we ask those who are involved in changing the legislation to be very careful.
And that's fair enough. But to be fair, Rudy Giuliani is a bit more than just an American citizen, because the average American citizen does not have the ear of the US president and does not have that sphere of influence. So, it doesn't really sit well, that kind of sort of denial. I mean, is there an indication that the US position is changing in terms of, has the anti-corruption campaign gone too far?
No, is the simple answer. There's no indication that the US position has changed at all. I mean, Giuliani said, after, one of my colleagues in New York talked to him for the article, and he made it clear to myself and to other journalists who also, reported on this, that he was talking in his own capacity, not as a representative of Trump, and said, to another journalist that maybe he should have made it clear that he was not, this was no official capacity. And he made it clear that he had been paid by something called the Freire Group, which is a consultant. Giuliani's own consultancy group was put on a retainer by this other American group that is headed by a former, I believe, CIA, but it could be FBI official director. And most of his information came from, a research report that they had put together. Now it is clear, that they have previously represented, and they may still represent, they haven't spoken to people and acknowledged who their clients are, but they have previously represented at least one, perhaps two Romanian businessmen who have been caught up in the anti-corruption fight and anti-corruption efforts. One of their former or present, we don't know, clients is currently living in London because he was sentenced to, I believe, 9 years in prison for a real estate deal. And he left the country before he could be sentenced and arrested, and he's now living in London. So, there is, once you follow the money, it's not all the details are known, and there are some gaps, but it paints a very, it raises some serious questions about his involvement in Romania.
It does indeed. And if we just kind of break it down to the sort of the simplistic level that I can understand, because when it comes to following money, I'm not very good at this kind of thing. I'm good at spending money, if it's any consolation. But it does sound an awful lot like Rudy Giuliani is being paid to defend corruption, or to defend people who do not want to tackle corruption.
I mean, that is...
Perhaps it's oversimplified.
There are many people in Romania who see that it's a, you know, who think that exactly that, you know, when it comes down to it, this boils down to Giuliani being paid to write a letter attacking anti-corruption efforts in Romania. And, you know, we still need more details, but, you know, that you could very easily argue that that's what it comes down to. It's brass points.
Right. So, I mean, has this worked? I mean, what has this letter achieved in terms of, you know, for the people who were perhaps employing Giuliani to write this letter? I mean, has it helped take the foot off the gas when it comes to anti-corruption efforts? What's been the, I don't know, the take?
I mean, I would say,
did they have value for money?
No, I mean, right now it feels like it may have backfired, you know, just because of the amount of attention this got and how quickly it became clear that, you know, in Giuliani's own words, that, you know, this was him as a private citizen. This was his consultancy firm hired and paid by another consultancy firm, that he based his information on a report from that firm that, again, has had these questionable clients in the past, at least, and maybe current, and presumably currently has some. And so, you know, it seems like it has not it was not a good spending of cash. But, you know, the politicians, the leader of the Social Democrat Party here and others have, you know, thanked Giuliani for his letter and said that, you know, he really hit the nail on the head. And so it is being used as propaganda. You know, it is being utilized by those who have said for a long time that the anti-corruption fight is going too far. It is using illegal tools, and it is, you know, attacking innocent people. And, you know, Giuliani's letter outlined, you know, the same arguments that are often used to criticize, you know, the anti-corruption prosecutors here.
And in terms of their choice of messenger, really, because, you know, Giuliani's saying, I'm a private citizen and all of this. But he's a private American citizen. And America still carries some kind of clout, does it not? It's like using a very prominent...
And he's more than an American citizen, as you've pointed out. You know, he is, you know, every day you hear about him, you know, in the press, you know, related to Trump for this story or that story. You know, yes. He is not his voice
and so
independent citizen.
And so does Trump help or hinder the cause here? I mean, I'm just wondering if it was an attempt to use American might to say, okay, let's wind this up now. The Americans are the arbiter of all that's good, and now it just shows you're going too far. Or does this reflect badly on the US and Trump, the Trump presidency on the whole, sort of bringing them on the wrong side of a corruption fight? I mean, if you look at it more broadly, what do you think the impact is?
I mean, it's hard to know right now. I don't think it will change many people's minds, you know, about whether the corruption fight, you know, those who support the anti-corruption fight, this won't have impacted anything. They'll, you know, just like Giuliani a bit less. Those who think the anti-corruption fight has gone too far and that politicians are being unfairly attacked, you know, this will maybe bolster them a little bit, and they might look like Giuliani a little bit more, but it doesn't change anything particularly on the ground. I mean, what it kind of does is, you know, over this last year and a half, when we've had this real fight over, you know, the ongoing efforts of the anti-corruption agency and prosecutors, an effort. I mean, Romania has had a huge amount of vocal support from international allies. You know, the country protesters, and then, you know, the anti-corruption agency and the anti-corruption effort has been widely praised in Brussels and in, you know, the US. And by the European Commission, and we've had kind of letters of, the multiple, like as recently as I think it was July, 11 or 12 embassies, including the US and Canada and a lot in the EU, wrote a strong letter, again, it's expressing their concerns about, this pushback and these legislation changes that, again, seem to weaken the anti-corruption fight. So, you could argue that this will be an international voice saying the opposite. So you can kind of, when one side pulls out and says, look, all our international allies are saying that, we need to continue this fight against corruption, then, the other side can pull out a letter from Giuliani saying, well, we've got the lawyer of Donald Trump, got the lawyer of the most powerful man in the world who has a very different point of view. And, so maybe going forward, it could still be, used in a battle of the propagandas.
Okay, and I know that we're kind of running over time here, Kit. Just quickly, where do you see this going next? What are the next things that we should be looking out for if we want to keep following this story?
It's hard to really know where it's going to go next. I mean, both sides are, pretty fixed. People, the political class are not, those who are pushing to defang the anti-corruption agency or to kind of remove some of their tools will keep doing that. If everything over the last year and a half hasn't changed their mind, they're not going to back down. The people protesting are, they have flagged a little in their energy and the numbers have dropped in recent past. But, the August 10 protests when, as I said, 450 or so people were injured, that's brought back energy. People are very angry. So, I mean, this is going to continue. And this fight against corruption and this fight against the fight against corruption is just I don't see it stopping anytime soon. And it's really hard to say how things will end.
Yeah, well, we will keep an eye on it. Thanks so much for joining us, Kit. And if people want to continue following your work, you're published in the New York Times and the Guardian, Christian Science Monitor as well, I think. We keep seeing your name pop up all over the place. Where's the best place to find your work if we want to keep following you?
I mean, you can find me on Twitter at Kit Gillet, or you can, New York Times, the Guardian. There's some things in The Economist that are mine, but you don't see my name on them. Around.
We'll see you around, and I hope we will continue to see you around. Kit, thank you so much for joining us from Bucharest. Thanks for listening to the Outwith podcast, and we'll hope to catch you at the same time next week. Bye-bye.